I want to thank both the College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture, as well as the School of Architecture for collaborating with us on this. It's been great to work with you all and think about intersections between what we're doing at our respective schools and colleges, and of course to bring in new audiences from both sides to an event like this. And then I also want to thank the School of Art Advisory Board, whose vision literally decades ago has made this VASE lecture series possible, as well as the VASE committee, very ably led by Sama Al-Shaibi, who as a committee coordinates all of the programming, arranges collaborations like the one we have with School of Architecture, and oversees all aspects then of the series over the course of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Oscar Lopez to welcome you all from architecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, so thank you to the School of Art. For us, this is very exciting, and I think we can feel the energy in the room, standing room only, and I think this is what happens when you break and you bring together great opportunities for collaboration, for discussion, and for invention. So this is really exciting for us, and we're hoping to kind of continue this sponsorship. So thank you to everyone that's been helping us put this together. And so for us as well, this is also the launch of an initiative that we started at CAPLA that has been generously sponsored by Jones Studio, which we're calling the Jones Studio Grand Challenges Lecture Series. And so this is a series that aims to engage students, faculty, and the broader professional community with thought leaders across disciplines who are actively shaping the future of architecture and society. This series will confront some of the most pressing social and environmental challenges facing our communities and the built environment today. This lecture series distinguishes itself from our regular CAPLA lecture series by focusing on solutions to large-scale architectural challenges. While the college's other lectures often concentrates on regional and national issues, the Grand Challenges series calls for interdisciplinary and global perspectives to equip the students with a comprehensive view of the world's pressing issues. So we really want to thank Brian Farling, Eddie Jones, and the Jones Studio family for confronting critical issues with us in the pursuit of inspiring others to do the same. And then also, I also want to thank Ryan Smith, our director at the School of Architecture, for supporting these crazy and overly ambitious ideas that, as you can tell, are worth it. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Jones Studio. Thank you to the School of Art. And thank you, Ron, for being our inaugural speaker for this series in our school. Thank you. Now, Lydia.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lydia C. I'm the Director of Galleries and Curator over at the School of Art, and I'm so delighted to welcome Ronald Rael tonight. Ronald Rael is an artist within and without traditional gallery and museum settings, who works across public and social practice, and who keeps materials, their identity, function, and performance at the center of his practice. As an educator, architect, author, multi-generational rancher, 3D printing pioneer, and serial collaborator, Rael invites curiosity about objects and materials and asks a lot of questions. My first encounter with Rael's work was the now iconic Prada Marfa, but it was the teeter-totter wall that solidified Rael and Rael Sanfratello, the ongoing collaboration with Virginia Sanfratello, as a major inspiration of my own practice. Rael is the chair of the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley with a joint appointment in architecture. As a design activist, author, and thought leader within the topics of additive manufacturing, border wall studies, and earthen architecture, Rael is interested in connecting indigenous and traditional material practices to contemporary technologies and issues. Widely published, collected, and awarded, and currently showing a fantastically moving installation at the Cooper Hewitt. Please join me in welcoming Ronald Rael.
Thank you, everyone. Such generous introductions and so many faces and fond memories of being here 15 years ago when I was a professor here for one semester. And so thank you everyone who made it possible for me to be here. And I'm really honored to be here. Oh, I want to close this window. There's a big window here. I'm going to have to stop this for a second so I can see my cursor. It's such also, a big part of the theme of my talk tonight is about coming together, and it's so beautiful that both the art departments and the architecture departments are coming together to join in this conversation tonight. And I'm going to get right to it. I found a sign in Nogales, Mexico once that said, "Las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une." Borders divide us, but the earth unites us. And this has been a theme of my practice for probably the last 6 years or so. I think it's really interesting to think about how borders divide, and the horror and humor that's embedded within that division that is highlighted by this photograph from National Geographic from the early 1900s. Someone being pulled across the border violently from both sides. The friends tried to rescue him, entirely staged by National Geographic, not a real photograph. But embedded in this are all the themes that have somehow come to in my work. This idea that borders divide is really just a conceptual idea, because we can as easily think about the notion that borders are actually the place where things come together, where countries come together, where people of different languages and ideas and religions and foods come together, and to create a new kind of hybrid. And it's within these hybrids that I find the borderlands a very productive laboratory for art and design. And in that way, I think about an expanded notion of the borderlands, that if we expand the ideas of the borderlands, they expand across geography, and they expand across geology, and they expand across time. When I think about the way they're expansive, I think about the historical relationship that I have to the border. My studio is based in this circle that spans the border between Colorado and New Mexico, in a territory that used to be the northernmost frontier of Mexico prior to the Mexican-American War. And we are connected to the contemporary US-Mexico border by the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River. This is the headwaters of that river, and this is the geological, hydrological connection that we have to that border, as well as that historical connection to the border, as well as cultural connections to that border, as well as political connections to that border across space and time that center around three themes, which are the militarization of the border, child separation at the border, and labor and enslavement as a product of borderland policies. In Colorado, which was the borderlands between the United States and Mexico, there are a number of US forts that look like this. This is Fort Bent. This is Fort Garland. Military forts that were established along the US-Mexico border to defend and protect, but also to enslave and to trade. But an architecture that actually learns from architecture that has existed in the region for thousands of years. Architecture that looks like this, a 1,000-year-old multi-story apartment building in Taos Pueblo, a village, a community that's still occupied. And those traces of what is a borderland continue to linger in these spaces, as they will in this space here of the contemporary borderlands, long after they are the borderlands. We see well into the 1930s, after the Mexican-American War in 1848, that the governor of Colorado would dispatch National Guard patrols to the state border to prevent people of indigenous and Mexican ancestry from entering into the state of Colorado. And border stops were made at the New Mexico-Colorado border at that time by the governor of Colorado. And even when the current president-elect was president, he declared that he was actively building border walls in Colorado, and everyone was uncertain where that was exactly. But this map emerged on the internet that maybe have described what he was thinking when he was imagining where those walls would be built. In these borderlands, the residue of that architecture of a borderland still exists. And I've embarked on a project that is probably a lifetime project of stewardship of over 15 traditional adobe buildings along the border of Colorado, New Mexico, that I'm in care of. And I use these buildings as a way to teach traditional and indigenous architectural practices, including my own home, a home that was built by my great-grandfather and my great-grandfather's sister. And I teach these methods of traditional construction, bringing communities together around Earth, a way to think about how the Earth can unite us, and a way to think about how we can continue these practices and learn from these practices, a way to embark upon using these materials in a 21st century culture. One of these buildings is just a few miles away from my studio and where I grew up, in fact. And it's a centerpiece of architecture in the community. It's a Ute Indian agency built in 1854. If you're unfamiliar with what an Indian agency is, they were built all across the United States. And I liken them to embassies between the US government and tribes. Unlike embassies, these were places where treaties were designed and resolved that removed Native Americans from their lands. In this case, this is an agency that served the Tabawacha Ute, basically served them their eviction notices to the reservations they are on now. But I use these buildings not only to connect us to the traditions of building in Earth, but also to connect us to the untold stories of these sometimes very humble but important buildings. This building prior to 1970 looked like this. It was an enormous fortification, a fort essentially, that housed the home of the first lieutenant governor of the state of Colorado, and also housed the home of the Indian agent to the Tabawacha Ute. It was mostly destroyed in 1970. This is what remains today. But something very particular historically happened in this building as well. It's happening at the confluence between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, which happened soon after. And during that time of the Civil War, the Indian agent, who you see this person right here, named Lafayette Head, embarked on a journey to take a group of Ute leaders to meet Abraham Lincoln in 1865 to negotiate a treaty. After Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson asked all Indian agents in the United States to document all slaves held within their territory. In this location, there were no African American slaves, but there were Native American slaves that were held there. And these census were taken in this location, and it documented 147 Native American slaves, mostly women and mostly children who had been taken from their families at that time prior to the Mexican-American War in those borderlands. And we can see, I'll just read to you what that says. It says, list of Indian captives acquired by purchase and now in the service of the citizens of Conejos County, Colorado Territory, is taken and rendered by Lafayette Head, U.S. Indian agent for the Tabawacha Ute Tribe of Indians, July 1865. We see the owner's name, the residence, the name of the Indian, the age, 25, 16, 11, 7, 38, 12, 18, 7, the tribe, Navajo, Ute, Paiute Creek, where purchased, when purchased, male or female, married or single, willing to return to tribe, and any remarks. A few years ago, I collaborated with the artist Chip Thomas to bring this story out and reveal this kind of lost history of this site. Chip, if you're unfamiliar with his work, is a very famous paste-up graffiti artist. He has his own relationship to slavery historically as an African American, but also, in addition to being a famous paste-up graffiti artist, he's also a medical doctor who lives on the Diné lands. And so we placed not only on the inside this list, but on the facade of the building to remind and to recall the traumatic histories that occurred at this site. And I work with a group called Native Bound Unbound, and they are documenting all ancestors of all Native American slaves so that people can connect to this history that's has been lost and untold. More recently, I've embarked on a project, I shouldn't say more recently, in the last 6 years, I've been continuing this project, a project that I call Casa Desenterrada, exhuming home. And I'm not only conceptually digging into the history more deeply, but also literally into this site with archaeologists and historians to uncover the artifacts of daily life that were found on that site. And this is the subject of the project that was mentioned that is now at the Cooper Hewitt Triennial in New York. And so we uncovered hundreds of objects of everyday life, a necklace, a draft horseshoe, a Bible, Native American pottery, and placed them in a way that allowed each of the mud bricks that was exhumed from the building that had been knocked down and turned and reconstituted back into a building material in the form of a kind of archive, an archive that houses the name of each of those children who were named on that census in 1865, objects from the site, and also accidental objects that were simply picked up from the ground in the making of the adobe bricks that came from the actual building itself. This practice of child separation of Indigenous children continued to be practiced and continues to be practiced today. You may be familiar with this sign, the last of which appeared in Orange County maybe 6 years ago, warning motorists of migrants that were dropped off alongside the road so that motorists don't hit them when they attempt to cross. The designer of this sign was actually a Native American designer, a Navajo, who worked for the California Department of Transportation. And he saw the plight of the migrant today as very similar to that of the Navajo during the Long Walk when they were displaced from their lands in a forced migration. And he smuggled in ideas of activism into this sign. Some of them had to do with who he thought drivers would empathize with the most, a little girl with pigtails, and also used the silhouette of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez as the head of the father. I wanted to build upon the genius of this sign during those times when child separation was so mentioned in the daily news during the pandemic, that I created a sign that people could use during protests, that I made open source. And I made one simple move to have the family turn to face each other and say reunite instead of caution. I made it available for download. People would download it. They'd use it in protests. I made signs to be installed alongside the highway, which caught attention of the For Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art project in the world. And they invited me to bring that sign back to the highway in a way that was very unexpected to me, an enormous LED billboard so that hundreds of thousands of motorists could see this sign every day, calling attention to the issue of child separation at the border. The sign was also at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine for almost 6 years. So this idea of inserting home into my practice, the way I think about the borderlands and the ideas that come from them continue. They continue in the way I teach traditional building practices, both within my community, and recently completed was a 15-year project where I taught a couple of young kids to make adobes, and they were hired by the local parish to build a space of contemplation. And after 15 years, they built one of the largest earthen structures, I don't know, in probably the Southwest, in the contemporary Southwest, which is an enormous labyrinth made of 40,000 mud bricks made over the last 15 years by just a handful of community members to make a space for internal reflection. For scale, that's me walking in it. If you wonder why it's white, it gets 20 below zero in this landscape, and that's during winter. Entirely made out of earth. And this practice of teaching has allowed me to begin to think about not only architectural practices, but cooking practices. And I began teaching ways of building mud ovens, both in the historic borderlands, but also in the contemporary borderlands, in a way that's a kind of passport for bringing a little bit of home to different places. If we think about this oven, this traditional mud oven, it's a cooking technology that came to the Americas 400 years ago by way of the Iberian Peninsula and caught on like a kind of microwave oven technology that spread across the continents. And it's so familiar to so many that I've had the opportunity to build them in different kinds of spaces in my own communities. This particular oven, which I call the Truth Oven, was built on a small sliver of peninsula of private land that jutted into the Trump winery. You can see the oven there. This table is an installation by the artist Ana Teresa Fernandez, where the goods from the oven can be displayed there. And the view is from the tasting room of the Trump winery. So while you're enjoying a delicious glass of Trump wine, you can look down at the table and see and contemplate about the ideas of truth. Thanks. I've also been working with the American Refugee Committee, now called ALIGHT, to think about how we can bring these cooking technologies to shelters, migrant shelters along the US-Mexico border and across the world in much faster ways. And I developed this inflatable structure that you simply could take earth from the site and pack it around and then deflate the structure to make an oven. And I've experimented with the speed of which you can make one with bricks and which you can make one with the inflatable, which is on the right. Oddly enough, the one on the right still exists and the one on the left doesn't. It's been exposed to the rain in Berkeley, California for the last 4 years. But it was also a space around which we would bring together communities, indigenous communities. And I had the opportunity to build one of these ovens in a migrant shelter in Nogales, Arizona, that was part of a documentary film called Pedacito de la Tierra, which you can watch online, which documents the construction of this horno, which allowed people from that community during the pandemic to have a little piece of home within that shelter. Some of them were there for over almost 2 years. Children were born there, and they could gather around this horno, people from many different countries, many different languages, to share stories and recipes and to create a community of their own. And that horno is still in use, and they bake over 250 loaves of bread every 2 days in this oven. Earth is an important part of my architecture practice, and several years ago I designed what was one of the first mud brick buildings to be built in Marfa, Texas, in over 100 years. A project that was both looked at traditional technologies and contemporary technologies. I call it the box house. It's a box within a box of mud and a box of infrastructure inside. And Prada Marfa, also nearby Marfa, but a project that also looked at the political implications of using earth as a material, each brick cast in a cementatious mortar, similar to how the US military constructed their forts along the contemporary US-Mexico border after the Mexican-American War in 1848. And to think about how these works transcend their objectness as cultural objects when they enter into the public sphere and take on a dimension of cultural meaning beyond the object itself, beyond the architecture itself. And perhaps Prata Marfa was the first project that demonstrated to me the difference between architecture and art, but also that blurred the boundaries between those two disciplines. Much of this work culminated in a book I wrote in 2008 called Earth Architecture that discussed how earth is a 21st century building technology and discussed the contemporary history of earthen architecture. But in the last chapter of the book, I speculated on what would be the future of earthen construction. And I had many thoughts about this related to the internet and the dissemination of these technologies, but also in 2008, 3D printing seemed to be something that was catching on. And I thought 3D printing might be the future of earthen construction. And very quickly I thought, well, maybe I could be the person that does that. So in 2009, I embarked on a project called Mud Frontiers that took me to many places, but made me begin to think about how we can use additive manufacturing in earthen construction. Much of this began in clay, in ceramics, but the political dimension of working in earth and clay and ceramics still was very close to me. And we developed a technology to 3D print with ceramics that today is now very common, but at that time, no one had really seen anything like that. One of the projects we called Bad Hombres, because the then president and now president-elect said that there were a lot of bad hombres at the border. And I thought, well, that's very insightful, but because he's seeing this gradient between cultures but what is a bad hombre? I don't know if it's a bad hombre or a good hombre. So we created a series of objects that we called bad hombres, and they were 3D printed vessels that demonstrated at different scales the particularities of two different soil types. Soils gathered from a democratic state and soils gathered from a Republican state, where you could understand the parts and the wholes and the distinctions and the details. But what if we were able to use the soils of the borderlands themselves? And that developed into a project where, working with the ceramics department at University of Texas, El Paso, and the geology department there, as well as 25 ceramicists from Juarez and El Paso, we embarked on searching for the clays of the borderlands and to have a discussion around the historical use of clay in that region and to think about this idea how earth connects us. And we developed a software so that anyone could replicate the techniques that we were employing to make those pots, because a ceramic artist at that time especially didn't have time to learn how to 3D model and 3D slice and 3D print. And so this is now a software that's sold all over it's used all in institutions all over the world, but it makes it very easy to make these objects. And so with these ceramic artists, we collected the clays of the borderlands, and we thought each ceramic artist would make one object, and they ended up making 250 over the course of the project. These beautiful clays of the various complexions that were found. These technologies developed into ways of thinking about architecture as well. Over 3,000 custom 3D printed ceramic cladding units for an accessory dwelling unit in Oakland, California, after the relaxation of regulations about not having to use an architect, employ an architect, or go before the planning board to build up to 1,200 square feet in one's backyard. So it was an exploration of those technologies that we were developing around 3D printing with clay, but also employed many of the other materials that were a byproduct of thinking about what materials exist in the landscape in the same way that an adobe is made from the earth material around us. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we could find sawdust from the Sierra Nevadas. We can find salt from the San Francisco Bay. We could find recycled grape skins from the wineries in Napa Valley to create a 3D printed facade using those materials. And exploring the idea how additive manufacturing could be employed in the making of architecture. Exploring not only the building itself, but the furniture and the furnishings within. A coffee pot made of coffee grounds, wine glasses made of grape skins. In a small transformative space that just explores the possibility of making. But the goal was, since 2009, to think about how this could be scaled up. And that required not only the scaling of the objects, but the scaling of the machines, because this was the goal. And I had the fortune to collaborate with a company that was making the same 3D printers that we were using at the time, 3D Potter. And I sent them this little sketch and said, could we make something like this? And we developed this together, a very inexpensive 3D printer that could print ceramics and print a number of ceramics at once, but also could print a very large object. We also had to think about how we scale the delivery of a material. That's a human 3D printer right there. And as we progressed in developing this, we were able to 3D print with pretty great accuracy soil material. And so when we had that confidence, we then embarked on bringing that technology to a remote location in the historic borderlands to print for the first time on the planet earthen explorations of proto-architectural spaces and forms. Some of the many technologies we developed around that very quickly, it was a very mobile and inexpensive printer that could use the material excavated right from the site. We developed different kinds, it's a 3-axis system. We developed a 4-axis just by being able to move the robot around, which allowed us to make multicellular spaces of rooms. Thinking about how we could print furniture. All driven by a cell phone. And the pandemic enabled us to leave the lab and explore how we could embark out into the landscape to take this kind of architectural research further. And the project we called Casa Covida. Covida is not really a word. It sounds like COVID, but also like Covida, like a house for cohabitation in the time of COVID. It's a 3-roomed house programmed with a space for sleeping. Recognize those guys? A space for cooking, using pottery that we also produced using earth from the site. And a space for bathing. A lot of my architecture friends said, well, it doesn't have a roof. And so we thought about, well, what are the ceilings in the borderlands? And often you see these aerostat blimps. So we thought that maybe a pneumatic roof would be appropriate for a 3D printed earthen building in the historic borderlands, one that imparted this quality of light into the space and was also like a cherry on top of a chocolate sundae. That project led to a project called Skylos, Silos de Cielo, a project at a historic drive-in theater called the Frontier Drive-In, a drive-in theater that recalled its positioning within the historic frontera. On its reopening, we hosted a Borderlands Film Festival along with the opening of this project, Skylows. It exists in a landscape that looks like this. If you've ever been to that particular region, it's a closed basin, meaning the water, with the exception of the Rio Grande River, doesn't flow to any ocean or gulf. It actually creates an ocean underneath the ground itself. So farmers tap that water source and grow potatoes and grain and barley that produces Coors beer. But these sprinklers that move around are very similar to the way the 3D printer works. And in that landscape are all these silos. And so we created a series of silos that don't hold grain, but hold the sky in this dark sky environment, and allow for the contemplation between earth and sky within these chambers. And it helped us begin to think about how we can develop this as an architectural technology. It became the first 3D printed earthen building in the world to be permitted and approved by the local municipality because it was a commercial, as a commercial structure. And it allowed us to think about how we can scale up. And you can see the beauty of this. This is my very expensive graduate student there, just watching and dressed very nice. And the laborer's not doing much work either. The robot's doing everything. It's kind of like a security job. Nothing really exciting happens until something goes wrong. But just a few views of that project and thinking about the architectural implications is that again, somehow is walking the line between art and architecture, really supported by the world of art, but has potential implications in the world of architecture. This idea of building in the borderlands, prior to the current president-elect taking over the presidency, before, I had completed a book called Border Walls Architecture, where I was very interested in the construction of the border wall and its implications as an architectural structure that defined and transformed the spaces along the US-Mexico border. And the book was an account of the stories and the impacts that the border wall had on people and ecologies and animals and cities and private property. And it's basically a story of the 800 miles of wall that were built after the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And to illustrate these stories, I created a number of objects that I called recuerdos, or souvenirs. And these souvenirs told these stories, and I illustrated them through architectural models in the form of snow globe souvenirs, board games, ant farms, postcards, maps, keychains. And they told the stories of animals who were unable to follow their natural and historical migratory routes in search of food and water. They told stories of peoples whose resilience continued to allow them to come together in the spaces along the border to celebrate their binational heritage. This is binational yoga classes that used to take place between San Diego and Tijuana before they built 3 walls to keep people apart in that zone. I've always feel they're doing the monument pose here. These monuments are what used to define the border prior to the erection of the wall. A swing that allows someone to cross over to the other country before gravity deports them to the other side. Something more close to home, cactus wall, which raises the questions of what it means to build in one of the most pristine landscapes and protected landscapes we have in the United States, which is Saguaro National Park, and what it means to think about an investment in the restoration of that park rather than its destruction through the construction of a border wall. One of those recuerdos was called Teeter-Totter Wall. And this illustration, which was done in 2009, illustrated the idea that the wall was a metaphorical fulcrum between labor and trade balances and imbalances, between the imbalances between wealth and poverty in the United States and Mexico, and also the snow globe of that. In 2017, there was a lot of excitement around this project. It was getting a lot of attention just through the drawings. And of many of the illustrations that were created, and I never saw them as projects themselves. I thought them as ways of talking about the issues of the border, in this case, talking about those labor and trade balances and imbalances. That what would it mean to actually construct this? And I went through a series of exercises to imagine the possibility of building this with actually no intention of inserting it on the wall. But I wanted to see it real. I actually went to the border wall and I carried large objects to see how long it would take the border wall to arrive. I measured the wall, imagined that a material in the vertical position divides, but a material in the horizontal position connects. And we fabricated this version of it in a welding shop in Juarez. And then we imagined, well, how can we smuggle design to the border? And how can the metaphorical fulcrum be an actual fulcrum? And this became the actual fulcrum of the teeter-totter wall, designed to insert into the wall, to think about all the logistics of the seats and the handlebars. And what color should it be? Should it be steel to highlight this notion of transforming the directionality of the material and the meaning of the material in its various orientations? Or should it stand apart from the wall itself and the violence of the materiality that it suggests? We went through several color schemes to imagine what it was, and working with a group, Colectivo Chopeque in Juarez, we finally settled on pink. Because pink in Juarez reminds us of the women who were killed during the time of violence when Juarez was the most dangerous city in the world. And we wanted to acknowledge that the border is a site of violence, and we wanted to acknowledge that while we were thinking about highlighting these issues, and these issues were in the form of play, that there was an underlying issue that is more important than that which happens on the surface. With so much talk about child separation and the construction of new walls during the time that the current president-elect was president, we decided one day that we would simply host a humble event with the children and families of that site. And this is how the day unfolded. It was a 40-minute event. We had been traveling to this site for over 10 years. We knew these kids. Border Patrol showed up just in 8 minutes, just like we knew they would. They asked what we were doing, and we said, well, we're having an event with the families, and they stood back and watched. This was a very tense time on the border, and very soon, Mexican National Guard arrived, heavily armed, and asked what we were doing. And the moms and aunts and grandmas on the other side said, we're just having fun, get out of here. And so they stood back and watched and smiled and took photos. And then I thought, what if I can get Border Patrol and Army National Guard to ride on the teeter-totters together? And Border Patrol said that wouldn't be very professional of them. And eventually, the kids, like in any park, just got tired. And we wrapped up and we called it a day. And while that was intended to be a very humble event, somehow it went viral on the internet. And I think partly because it was such a tense moment in global history when we were building walls between us, not only walls between countries, but walls between our political affiliations, between our religious ideologies, between our identities. And there was so much pressure that it felt like that we had stabbed a dragon and it inflated and it brought hope to people. And we also had the opportunity to show a different narrative of the US border that we weren't seeing on the media. That the borderlands weren't just a place, or aren't just a place where there are bad hombres doing bad things, but it's a place where mothers and children live and thrive and have joy with their families despite the oppression and the violence of the wall. After that project, a lot of crazy things happened. Many museums wanted to replicate the teeter-totter wall. Some people just replicate it in parks all around the world. There's in Italy, there's just people started to think it was better to ride a teeter-totter in a park with a wall in front of it than just a teeter-totter. One museum, the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon, wanted us to recreate the wall within their galleries. And we said, well, absolutely no, this is an entirely contextual project. It doesn't make any sense for us to do that. Why would we do that? And they pushed and they pushed. And we said, well, so we got a little crazy and we said, well, what if we build the wall as big as the wall is and we use the same amount of steel? And they said, okay. I said, well, what if we divide the entire museum in half so that the visitors have to walk all the way around the wall and it's so inconvenient? And they said, okay. So what if we put barbed wire on top of the wall? And they said, okay. Well, all right, I'm in trouble. And I laid down one more condition, which is I have an optimistic view of the future in which we dismantle that wall. And what do we do with the millions of tons of steel that were used to construct that wall? So I asked, after the exhibition, can we use this as a way to create a study model for a house using that material? And they said, okay. So we were able to take this material and we designed a house called Teeter Totter House. We included an horno because it was built in Portugal, where the oven it continues to be used in Portugal today, but it also migrated there across the Americas and is used today here. And we transformed this, it's even crazy for me to look at it now, into this, using all the same material from that installation to make this teeter-totter house in a public park in Braga, Portugal, where there's a large migrant community that work in a local steel factory. And they use this as a place to gather and hang out, and even sometimes to cook bread. They make really nice hornos there in Portugal. Thank you. When Biden became president, on his very first day, he stopped all border wall construction. Do you remember that? And all these construction workers went home, and there were millions of tons of steel left alongside the border for the taking. And so with the help of Arizona State University, we actually smuggled 10,000 pounds of that steel into the galleries to create a house. These are the units we smuggled. They're the horizontal pieces that hold the steel pieces that are an angle in the verticals, to create a project that we call Casa Unida, a project that uses 10,000 tons of this, 2,000 pounds of this steel and slowly lifts up the veil. It feels light like a feather and a wing that brings light inside the space, that takes on this idea of welcoming and a place for gathering. If you've been to that gallery, there are two galleries. In one gallery, we built Casa Unida, and in the other gallery, we built Casa Dividida, House Divided. House Divided grew out of one of the recuerdos that spoke to the notion that the wall doesn't divide two landscapes, it separates one landscape. On one side, it might look like this. Someone's mowing the lawn in the backyard. And on the other side, the wall serves as the fourth wall of someone's house. We created a set of blueprints called House Divided. On the right side, you see the average size of a house in El Paso, Texas, and on the left side, the average size of a house in Juarez, Mexico. You see the different dimensions of the rooms, the different building thicknesses, the space requirements, but you also see the wall dividing the bed in the bedroom. In the opposing gallery, we built the bedroom. A bedroom that describes two spaces that are so close yet so far apart, the things that we hold in common and the things that make us different, the traumas and the troubles, the bills and the pills. It's filled with, I don't know, you see the crucifix cut in half. The fabricator didn't want to do that, but ended up doing it. The have a little faith pillow. The ceramic pottery on the wall, on the deer skin, on the kind of Native American motif, the trastero, the cupboard in the picture, photos of family. And we used this as a space that we invited people who had been separated to actually spend time in and come together. This is a mother and daughter who had been separated for many years. In House Divided, there are two rooms. And here you see the wall dividing the table in the kitchen. There you see the actual cupboard filled with the foods of that particular side. You see the actual pottery on one side. You see the stains and the droppings and the grime and the grit and the textures and the architecture and the difference between the two. We developed this project with a group from Juarez called the Border Architecture Laboratory. Many of members were also from Colectivo Chopeque, who helped us with the teeter-totter wall. This idea of making or thinking about how architecture can be a medium for art, or that art can heavily influence architecture, something that continues in the practice as I continue to push the idea about how we approach architecture or approach ideas of making homes. More recently, I begin to wonder how we can transform traditional technologies in different ways that might advance the way we think about construction in the 21st century. There's a very ancient and traditional way of building a roof out of mud that was developed by the Nubian culture in Sudan and southern Egypt. And the way it works is that the wall is built and simply you lean bricks against that wall in the form of a parabola, and you just allow them to extrude out to make a wall. And I wondered if a robot could do this. And so we embarked on a series of tests to see if it was possible for a robot to produce those same kind of algorithms. We couldn't do it as steep because it's actually extruding a very wet material instead of a dry adobe brick. This pattern allows for there to be friction, so this layer above holds next to the layer below, since it's at a cantilever. The textures allow the interlocking of the material with friction, but it actually slows down the movement of rain across the facade. Also an ancient technology to create a texture on an earthen wall so that rain doesn't create a small river eroding the wall faster. And we're able to achieve the first 3D printed roof in the world. And not only that, but made out of mud. Here you see the final closures of this. Maybe I can fast forward a bit. And the beauty of this also is that it's using earth harvested right from the site. You see my then 12-year-old son is managing the mud. I'm flying a drone while driving a robot, and we're building a building. And this is it, a small, humble test that maybe has implications in the making of architecture in the future. Because it certainly had implications in the making of architecture in the past. So I continue to push, and it's really my focus now to think about how we can bring this technology into the making of architecture. This was made this summer. It was the biggest single thing I made, mostly by myself. I had some help early on in the first couple of feet, but like one person making this object over the course of a couple of weeks. And all of this is leading to a project that I'm embarking on now called Muddy Robots, the combination of mud and robots, and exploring AI, exploring ancestral intelligence, additive intelligence, and artificial intelligence, and how those three can come together to think about how we can reintroduce Earth as a 21st, 22nd century material. Echoing off of the Smithsonian Magazine's belief that the #1 thing you should know about the next 40 years is that sophisticated buildings will be made out of mud. So I'm taking on the challenge to think about how we can reimagine Earth as a 21st century building material that responds to our 21st century lives, something that responds to an environment that has been intoxicated by the materials that we surround ourselves with. The latex paint being the #1 contributor to the microplastics that are flowing into your bloodstreams right now. Concrete that has produced an enormous amount of carbon dioxide emissions that are causing global warming. And how can we begin to imagine spaces that might be familiar to us in the way we might live today? And how can we imagine spaces and forms that take on the potential that a robot can produce, new kinds of textures and possibilities, new kinds of forms and surfaces, so that perhaps one day soon we can reimagine our lives as being integrated with a building material that mankind has developed over 10,000 years ago. That is the most perfect building material that we can imagine moving forward. Thank you very much.
Checkity check. Okay, thank you so much. A few housekeeping items before you leave. There are folks sitting on the ground outside the doors, so please be gentle as you walk out into the lobby. You really had a packed house. We're going to take a few questions, and to make sure that our folks watching on Zoom at home can have access to your voices, please wait for us to get to you with the mic before you start asking your questions. Hands up, questions? All right.
Great presentation, Ron. So, as I warned you before, how do I get my hands on one of these robotic arms? And seriously, and did you have to modify it in order to be able to extrude Adobe?
No, I mean, the first robot I co-developed with this company, 3D Potter, and it was designed with the principles of mobility and that it was affordable. And they actually they've commercialized that robot and they sell it today and it's used all over. So you can actually purchase one of those and it's quite affordable. And it's at the
What's
scale
the
now.
definition of affordable?
Well, if we compare it to the robot that I'm currently using, that robot isn't affordable. That robot is like $250,000. The other robot is in the range of 30. I haven't looked at their website lately, but it's about probably $40,000 and can build a house. Yeah. I mean, affordable if you're going to build a house. I don't know. For the average person, I don't know. I mean, it's a question of access, you know, there's questions of access that are important to me.
But these robotic arms, were they originally developed to extrude concrete?
The robotic arm that I'm using now was developed decades ago, and it's used in automobile and aerospace manufacturing. They're designed to do, you know, simple movements over and over again, weld a door, weld a door, weld a door. But they're very flexible in that they have 6 axes. And so I also benefit by using earth in that the 3D printing industry around concrete is moving quite rapidly, and technologies are always getting better and more inexpensive and more precise. And they're all suitable for earthen construction, whereas they're all refining them to particular mixes of very expensive 3D printed concrete. So I have the advantage of the industry leading that way for concrete, and I can use it for earth.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie.
I see you.
Amazing presentation. Do you think something like this, that 3D printing with earth or concrete, anything like that, do you think that it's always gonna stay on like a smaller scale, like whether that's more artwork and residential life, or do you think it's gonna eventually become this bigger scale thing, making like cityscapes with it?
Yeah, I mean, there are hundreds of companies that exist now that are 3D printing with concrete, and all very large scale construction companies want to move to automation. I'm of a handful of 1 or 2, 3 people on the planet who are 3D printing with earth. Some are doing it in an academic sense, some are making machines, and I'm someone who's interested in scaling it to scale not just from art projects or one house, but actually scaling it to think, what does it mean to build 20 houses, 1,000 houses this way? So that's the vision behind Muddy Robots. So we'll see where that goes. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Bean with the School of Architecture. I'm curious about building code. You mentioned that the ADU project in Oakland allowed you to experiment because it relaxed or eliminated some of the restrictions imposed. And one of the reasons all these other companies are printing with concrete is because it's a recognized material in the building code. We have a regional effort underway that's supported by the Department of Energy, we're a small part of, to revise the building code for the Southwest. And if you could suggest what direction that could take, or if there are particular stipulations that could be included, or an approach that could be included to allow more work like this, what would it be?
Well, earth is also already recognized by the International Building Code. And so it's really about meeting the structural requirements or energy requirements of the building. So it's really those 2 things. Concrete has actually had a tough go of it in 3D printing. And so even though the material is recognized, the process is not, but the process of depositing earth is very similar to the process of depositing earth by hand, which is recognized. So if we can meet those structural regulations, which we have, the Skylos was tested. We went through structural tests. We worked with an engineer. And that was easy. There's something that's happening that I haven't tested yet that, as many of you in the room may know, when a potter is what is it called when a potter does this? Amasando, yeah, wedging. So when a potter is wedging, what they're actually doing is pushing the clay particles together tighter and tighter so that the clay body is stronger. The pump is pushing those clay particles of adobe together stronger and stronger. Some of those early projects are now 6 or 7 years old, and they were only 3 inches thick, and they're still there after -20, below zero rains, winds, floods, which is surprising to me. So I think something's happening there where the structural strengths are actually stronger. So, I mean, I think it's about, for me, my belief is it's the preconception of what Earth is that has to be overcome more than building regulations. I think that everyone I've talked to, I'm doing a project in Palm Springs now, and they're like, yeah, no problem, we can pass this through the building code. I talked to an architect in LA who's been working on this, and he's like, oh yeah, this is easy. But it's the preconception, I think, of what Earth is and who it's for that has to be overcome. Many people think Earth is just for the poor, it's for people in developing countries, and they don't recognize the sophistication of it. Maybe this is a particular region that does, but that's more rare across the Southwest. Thank you.
So this next question might ramble a little bit because I'm not exactly sure how to phrase it, but I grew up in the San Luis Valley where I think you're doing a lot of your work. And we talk about like bridging the gap between like art and architecture, and you're bridging the gap between the borders and how everyone is coming together. And you talked a lot about the history of that area, but there's still a lot of dynamics at play there with like very strong Republican feels and very just conservative and doesn't like change. And I'm curious as how your actual work is received in the area and what it's doing in the actual landscape and in the hearts of people in the area, and how that is changing your work now, maybe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, where did you grow up in the San Luis Valley?
I'm from Monty.
Okay. Monty, yeah, that's what they say in Monty. What's your name?
MJ.
MJ, okay. I mean, I'm like an entrenched 7th generation member of that community. So I know everybody. And so I don't know, probably some people don't like it. Some people do. I mean, it's like anywhere else, but I'm working really closely with a lot of people there on some of these projects. And on some of these projects, nobody really cares. And I'm doing my own thing because it is a small rural community, but.
So you're not getting any like pushback or anything from like various.
I'm not getting any pushback. If anything, I'm getting lots of support and love from the community doing these projects. But you can think about this in different ways. But I'm from Conejos County, which is the southern county. It's largely Hispanic. It went easily for Trump. I don't know why, but well, I can guess why. But things are changing. But I don't think there's. I haven't perceived any pushback. I've really gotten a lot of support in a lot of ways. I actually probably wouldn't have accomplished a lot of this if I didn't have this support. Because I can go to an Amish person like this and say, I need this fixed now, and they'll fix it. I can go to some of the pump guys up in Monte Vista and say, do you have this part? And they're like, do it now. So I can go to guys and say, how do you make Adobe better? And they're like, this is how you do it. Yeah, we'll have to talk about the San Luis Valley. You're the first person I've ever seen from the San Luis Valley in a lecture.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bird Harris, and I'm visiting this week from Atlanta. So I'm wondering if this earthen architecture works primarily or only in arid climates. And if so, how have you thought about how this might transfer to more tropical climates?
Yeah, earthen architecture is built in every climatological zone and every country on the planet. But I'm not sure additive manufacturing is the best for all those zones in the same way that Adobe isn't. There's lots of different technologies for building in humid climates and dry climates and cold climates and wet climates. And this is just different. But in mapping out what a market would be, it would be largely the American Southwest that extends into Canada and extends deep into Mexico. And as a global market, it spans all over the planet. And unfortunately, in the United States, or fortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, is that dry, arid rain shadow is extending further and further east. And we're going to find that the desert environments cross the Mississippi in the coming decades. So we'll be building in Alabama soon. Thanks.
You haven't made mention of any type of stabilizer or amendment to the earth. And I've worked a lot with earth, and I find that you've got shrinkage issues and you've got erosion and you've got, and in our building code here, the thickness to height ratio is 1 to 10. So if you have a 10-foot wall, it has to be 1 foot thick. And I didn't see that reflected in your work. And I'm wondering, what have you found in terms of the long-term stability of mud? It's fine when it's dry, but when it gets wet, it erodes.
Yeah.
So I guess that's all part of one question.
Yeah, I come from a heritage practice of building with earth that has a lot of traditional knowledge embedded in it that responds to those. I'm completely opposed to stabilizers. Putting cement in the mixture at a same percentage of what you would make concrete out of does not, for me, make earthen architecture. Placing emulsified asphalt, which many of the major Adobe production yards put in the earth buildings, is like creating brown fields everywhere you make a house. So I'm completely opposed to it. I'm interested in learning more and applying how ancestral intelligence can inform the way we make these buildings. Things like roofs, things like planned erosion in thicknesses, a return to thick walls. If we think about the section of a wall today, it's completely co-opted by corporations. From the inside to the outside, there's 20 to 15 corporations, all with legal representation that want to sell you a product to find a space within that wall section. But we could return to earthen plasters. We can return to mass. We can return to clay-based plasters in the interior and find a single solution to a building technology.
Yeah, ideally that'd be great. Yeah, we've used a lot of earthen and plaster, lime plaster instead of cement. I wonder what you do for foundations. And what do you do for foundations?
I wish we could return to stone, but concrete foundations.
Sure.
We all have to be hypocrites at some point. We
Well,
can't escape. We can't
No,
escape it.
we have to be realists. We have to be
Yeah.
realists. Okay, well, it's fascinating work, and it looked like the plasticity, of your material, and it looks like it's high in clay and it's high in water, and I'm amazed that it doesn't crack up when it dries. But that's probably the particle size distribution, or
Yeah, there's particle size distribution that ranges from 1/4 inch to silt and clay particles. I was going to show you something really quickly, which is, some of this works on those principles of the cricky-cracky walls in England, which you can just corrugate a material and give it much more strength. So this is a 10-foot high wall that's a little bit less than 6 inches, made entirely of earth. And yeah, there are some cracks, but earth cracks, concrete cracks, everything cracks and shrinks and spans. And yeah, thank you. I'm not calling them. Somebody else is walking around with the mic.
Check it. Oh,
Okay. So you mentioned Taos earlier. What is your opinion of the earthships located on the Taos Mesa and how they implement waste located on the earth with the earth of the site itself?
Oof. I'm very interested in upcycling materials, as I've done in a number of projects with sawdust and salt and rubber tires, and I've actually done that with 3D printing. I'm less interested in earthships. I actually don't, I don't want to make a correlation between a 10,000 year long heritage practice of constructing with earth and people stacking tires in the desert. To me, those are different. And I have my own opinions about it. I grew up when that landscape was pristine, and now it's dotted with abandoned buildings that are made out of tires and bottles. And so I have my own opinions about it, but they're not connected in my mind. And that's the one thing I want to express, that building through the lens of heritage practice is not an alternative building practice. It is human tradition building practice. There's not alternative materials and they're clumped into some alternative material scenario, but they're really a long-term, as I say, heritage practice of developing these systems around human needs and technologies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've been told that unfortunately we are running out of time. It's like
Yes.
the end of Bake Off, and I have the hard job of saying we can't take any more questions. But what we can do is thank you so much for your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you all.